We are the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We discover the people practices that drive high performance. We do this through our human capital research. We like to focus on what really distinguishes high-performing organizations from their low-performing counterparts. We do this by looking at revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction in all of our major study surveys, and then really teasing out what the top quartile, the high-performing companies are able to do differently in their HR practices than the lower quartile. We are a member-based organization. You see here just a small sample of our member companies. So I want to extend a special welcome to anyone on the call who might be with one of our i4cp members. You see that membership really is quite broad. We've got really large organizations like Amazon, Microsoft, Ford, Accenture, and others. We've got smaller organizations. They really span across all industry verticals, from government and nonprofits to high tech to retail, big pharma, and much more. We have these calls every Thursday, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. So glad you can be with us for the next hour or so. As I said earlier, please introduce yourself in the chat and then keep the chat open. We'll be using that throughout the call today. My name's Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst at i4cp, and most weeks I'm here to co-host this event. We often have external guests. Today we have a special event with two of my internal colleagues that I'll introduce in just a moment. But I wanted to note the upcoming calls. We were off last week for the U.S. 4th of July holiday, of course. Prior to that, we had some great guests from Walmart and other companies. All these calls are recorded. We have an archive now going back a couple of years. So if you miss one, you can certainly go back and view the recording, download the slides, read the notes. The ones upcoming, you see we've got some great HR leaders from companies like Merck, HPE, and then Wells Fargo as we get through the month of July and into the month of August. But for today, we've got two of my internal colleagues. We have our CEO and co-founder, Mr. Kevin Oakes, and my fellow senior research analyst on the research team, Mollie Lombardi, and they are here to give us the highlights from our brand new research study, the Productivity Predicament. So I'm going to turn things over to Kevin and Mollie, and they're going to walk us through some of these exciting key findings.
All right. Thank you, Tom. And welcome, Mollie. I'm glad you could do this with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
This was a lot of Mollie's hard work and a number of people on the team as well. But this is a new study that we'll be releasing just in a few days called the Productivity Predicament, as Tom mentioned, kind of a mouthful. But it's a study we're excited about. The pendulum that you see in the background is really symbolic of why we decided to embark on this study. We heard from a number of our member companies that while they were emphasizing a lot of empathy right after the pandemic, and a lot of managers were asked to do that, they were conditioned to do it, many of them were focused on empathy. The focus on productivity may have waned in those companies immediately after the pandemic. And what we've seen since is a general swing back towards a focus on productivity. But many of these same organizations are wondering, have we gone too far, or have we swung too quickly away from empathy and too much focus on productivity? At the same time, there's been a lot of productivity discussion more broadly, which I'll get to in a second. But you can see some of the survey demographics. We had some great responses. A lot of different geographies were involved in this study. We got a great response too from senior executives, C-level, board member, et cetera, to respond to this particular study itself. Mollie, any other background that you want to give?
No, just that in addition to the general findings today, in the coming weeks, we're going to have a specialized report on productivity in EMEA and the findings from EMEA, and then also Asia Pac in August. So keep those in mind for your colleagues in those areas, or yourself if you're in those areas as well.
Excellent. Well, a lot of you have probably read some of the productivity woes that we've seen, certainly in the US, but it's really been worldwide. One of the headlines that really got our attention a few months ago was the Washington Post headline that productivity has declined in the US and no one's really sure why. But the same phenomenon has happened in other countries around the globe. We're just showing a couple different headlines here. And let me just give you a little, some statistics around this. So the recent productivity news really has not been great. The output per hour worked at US non-farm businesses, which is also known as labor productivity, was 0.8% lower in the first quarter than it was a year earlier. And that was the fifth consecutive quarterly drop, the first time that's happened since 1947, which is why this is making headlines. The annual statistics for 2022 showed that labor productivity declined in 37 states in the US, and it was overall a 1.2% total drop overall. Now, when we talk about these statistics, it's all coming from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they're calculating this by dividing an index of real output by an index of hours worked by all workers. But the US productivity in particular has plunged, and in the first quarter it was down 2.7% versus the same quarter last year, and that's almost a 1% year-over-year drop. Concurrently, quarter-over-quarter output grew slightly, and hours worked also grew by 3%. So that what that really means is that people are working longer hours, but not putting out more products, more services, and just not being as productive as they're used to. And so that's what the broad statistics are saying, but we're hearing the similar things from organizations. There's been concern around, are we being as productive as we could be? And there's a lot of reasons people have put out there for why, this might be occurring. Flexible work, people working remotely, being forced back to the office, have all been tossed out there as reasons why productivity might be declining. We've heard lower immigration as a reason. We've heard inflation as a reason. Employees are burned out. I mean, it just goes on and on. There's a lot of theories on why this has occurred, and so that's why this topic was pretty interesting to us. Mollie, I'll let you talk to this slide just as we looked at, high and low performers overall.
Yeah, I mean, it probably isn't surprising to anyone that high performance was correlated with productivity, but I think given all the stats that Kevin just shared as well, it isn't just, even high performance organizations that are feeling productive, they may not be as productive as they had once been, because when you look at these overall statistics of all companies, productivity is down. And again, I think also the bit of it is perception, right? If you're doing well, you're less likely to ask a lot of questions about productivity because you assume it's there. Whereas if you're struggling in terms of performance, you're definitely going to put a lot of laser focus on what's happening with productivity. So this is just sort of showing that we're seeing a strong correlation between top performance and productivity, but we really wanted to dig in and understand, among those high performance organizations, what are they doing differently to achieve that environment of productivity and performance.
And keep in mind, as Tom outlined at the beginning, when we talk about high performance organizations, we're talking about companies that have better revenue growth, profitability, market share, and customer satisfaction over the last 5 years. And that's the way we bifurcate all of our research. Now, it's interesting when you talk about this subject of productivity, because there is some subjectivity in it if you don't have really hard measures. And I love this statistic that Microsoft came up with, again, a few months ago, where they asked employees, are you productive at work? And 87% of employees said, hell yeah, I'm productive at work. When they asked leaders, do you have full confidence that your team is productive? Only 12% of leaders said that they have that full confidence. And it's almost an equal percentage here that adds up to 100%. So, I think we see this play out in a lot of organizations where employees feel like they're working as hard as ever, but the organization itself is wondering, are we getting full productivity out of employees, and do they trust that they're getting that full productivity out of the employee base? So Mollie, this is really the genesis of the report, but I'll let you describe what we found here when we looked at empathy and productivity.
Yeah, and that disconnect in the last slide was really, I mean, of course you're going to have issues with empathy and trust and things like that when you think about that disconnect, right? The employees feel that they're working really hard and managers don't. But we found that organizations that list both productivity and empathy among their top 3 priorities post-pandemic. That had a hugely strong correlation to trust, goal achievement, and culture health. So it wasn't the one or the other. It's actually organizations that found a way to balance that pendulum and swinging back, instead of swinging back and forth, really trying to balance that empathy and productivity was actually what was driving trust, goal achievement, and culture health. So it's not one or the other. It really is that combination of both. And we talk about some strategies to achieve that.
Yeah, not a huge shock that the best managers out there and the best organizations are able to emphasize both, for sure. Now, when we ask organizations, what is your current work model policy? And this is something that has changed rapidly over the last several months. You can see that a number of organizations have gone to a hybrid model where employees are required to be in the office or on site certain days of the week or a certain amount of time per week. And that is really the way most of the workforce is operating these days, where companies don't really like using the word forced. So we, use different terms like agile and flexible and other things, but it really is a requirement to be on site. There are other organizations that have required companies to be on site full time, and those have been well documented. And then there's a relatively small percentage of companies that are either fully remote or are allowing full flexibility where employees decide where they work. And we're showing this because a lot of the work model decisions are affecting what's happening, I think, with productivity for sure. And that's what the research is backing up, as well as just what's happening with the culture overall inside the organization. Now, when we ask companies, what were the reasons given for your current work model, there were 3 answers that really bubbled to the top: collaboration, culture, and productivity. And I see this in news articles all the time when CEOs or corporate spokespeople are talking about why they've asked employees to come back to the work site. They will often use one of these 3 terms. And selection of these 3 terms, we found from a research perspective, was either very weakly or negatively correlated with overall performance and achievement of goals. And in particular, that productivity reason is not a valid reason from the research perspective. Quietly, we've heard from a lot of organizations who are concerned that their return to office, their hybrid policies are actually limiting productivity inside their organization. It gets very emotional in many organizations, and I'm sure many of you on the line feel that way. This discussion is one that is ongoing for sure, but the research really doesn't back up any of these reasons for why we want somebody on premise or on site overall. So we give you that as a backdrop before we go into our 4 key findings. And Mollie, do you want to review these?
Sure. So what we found is, it wasn't that being on site's bad or being remote is bad. It really is no matter where people sit. And often HR and the rest of the business doesn't get to make those decisions. They are sort of thrust upon you, but no matter where your team sits, these are things that are going to help you drive that productivity and performance that you're looking for. So we found that productivity flourishes in environments of trust. High performance organizations prioritize both the what and the how of goal achievement. So it's not just what you achieve, but do you do it in a way that makes you a good colleague and that helps you contribute to the organization's overall values. Again, empathy and productivity are not mutually exclusive. It's about finding a balance and training your managers to find a balance between those 2. And the last one is generative AI. We've been talking about a lot. You've probably been hearing about it a lot, whether you are experimenting with it or not. I'm sure it's something you hear about every day. But generative AI will significantly impact productivity.
So let's go into those key findings. We'll start with the first one here. Just taking a look at how productivity is flourishing in an environment of trust. Trust is something that, as we began exploring this whole subject, just kept coming up over and over again as a real core thing that defined whether a company was productive or not. We actually found it explained 18% of increased productivity since the start of the pandemic in organizations. And we created this trust index. Mollie and her team came up with these 5 variables that we mapped to around the senior leadership is trusted by employees, that managers are trusted by their direct reports, that employees trust their team members, that senior leaders trust their employees, and that managers trust their team members. And it's interesting to map those this index and how companies responded to these questions and correlate it back to performance. How did they do overall as an organization? And the results were rather startling. And Molly, I'll let you walk through this particular graph.
Yeah, and someone in the chat had just asked how trust was measured, and this is really sort of the index of things we put together to measure trust and really talk about, it's a bi-directional, omnidirectional trust. It's not just senior leadership trusting employees and vice versa. It really is among colleagues and managers as well. What we found is, again, those high-performing organizations were significantly different in their agreement with the fact that they have that kind of trust throughout their organization. So anywhere between, you can see 3.5% and 11% more likely to have these different levels of trust. And whenever I look at the slide, I was a little bit sad thinking about the companies where only 3% of the organizations feel that their senior leadership team is trusted by employees and senior leaders trust their employees. That's got to feel pretty awful, right? To work in an environment where that's true.
Let's put a little bit of a caveat on that. This was respondents who said they strongly agreed with these statements. So we had a 5-point Likert scale, and we're taking the top end of that scale and by comparison, but it's pretty telling when you do take that top end of the scale.
Yeah, especially when you think about that senior leadership trust, and even among direct reports and colleagues, really sort of a sad state of affairs in low performance companies. I think any of us who've been in organizations where that's true have felt both in low productivity, trust erodes, and trust eroding causes low productivity.
Yeah. We found this same kind of disparity in a previous study that we did on culture fitness, where we found when you looked at the impact on organizational health, those companies that said that they had a toxic culture were 16 times more likely to say they had a lack of trust in senior leaders, and that was an issue they needed to be addressed. They also were 10 times more likely to say they didn't have psychological safety in their environment, so it was unsafe for them to express opinions or concerns. And conversely, companies with healthy cultures, they consistently told us they have leaders who lead by example. They're held accountable for the employee experience or employee outcomes, such as career mobility and career development, et cetera. They regularly communicate values, and in their organization, they're addressing poor behavior right away. They're not letting brilliant jerks exist inside the organization. Whether somebody's successful or not from a business perspective, it's how they got there that's something that they're concerned about. And if there's poor behavior, they're addressing it right away. Now, Molly, we found an interesting stat around how you can create trust inside the organization.
Yeah, and one of the questions actually showing up in the chat was, how do you build trust, right, in an environment where it's been eroded? And we found that high performance organizations, they actually train for trust. They actually train managers and leaders in how to set goals with their team members. They train them in providing developmental feedback, which is different than just general feedback. Developmental feedback is very much focused on what can we do next, how can we learn from this, give feedback to help people grow, and performance coaching. So one of the things is providing opportunities to learn these key coaching skills and train for them. It's not just something that we hope managers develop as they get promoted, right? It's not inherent it doesn't come with the business card with the managerial title. It really is something you have to train for. So that's one of the things we found was helping organizations build trust. And the other one is building trust through autonomy, which is on the next slide, because it's a way to sort of start to experiment with trust. You can set people with a goal and give them autonomy as individuals and as teams to go about achieving them. And one of the best ways to build trust both directions is to set goals together, achieve them, and do it again and again and again and again and again. And we'll talk about that with how you do that with some of the goal setting processes. When you're building that trust, it's little steps if it's been broken, but it can take, like employee engagement, when we would talk about that, it can take 1,000 acts to build it and 1 to destroy it. So be cautious as you're thinking about setting goals and as you're thinking about setting levels of autonomy, but also train your managers, give them skills to help them build that trust as well.
I think as we talk about return to office or versus flexibility, this autonomy equation is a big one. I think a lot of individuals are feeling like they have less autonomy when there is a peanut butter spread edict across the organization, not really accounting for different styles of work, different situations of employees might find themselves in. I've often told senior executives, anytime you're putting out a blanket policy like that across the organization, you're immediately creating exceptions, and there are people who have different situations that they're, are concerned about, talking to their managers about. And that's why you've seen some of the petitions or the walkouts by employees who have rebelled against, some of these policies. A big part of it is just feeling like we're not trusted and we don't have that autonomy. So I think that's playing a big part in how people are feeling about trust these days. All right, let's move on to our key finding number 2, and I'll let you talk to this, Mollie.
Yeah, so again, it's about the what and the how. It's not just what you do, but again, that no brilliant jerks policy, right? You can't do well at our company without doing good as well, is kind of what we're saying. And what we found actually is that high performance organizations are more than 4 times more likely to agree that culture values how goals are achieved and not just achievements themselves. So it's not enough in high performing companies. They realize it's not enough just to hit the goals. You have to do it in the way that makes you a good corporate citizen. And actually, you'll see in one of the case studies, if you remember and download the report, that one of our case studies, they featured they revamped their performance scorecard to indicate how good people were to each other, and that made it so even though productivity can be defined lots of different ways, they defined their productivity levels as people who are getting things done and getting them done in the right way. So it wasn't a productivity scale that was like, are they producing X widgets? It was really, are they achieving what they said they would do, and are they doing it in the right way? So it's really about how you balance those two when you set goals and when you give feedback on goals as well.
We created another index as part of this study that was a manager effective index. And this one had 4 different variables that explained a 19% increased productivity since the start of the pandemic. And Mollie, I'd love it if you could walk us through these 4 variables.
Yeah, I mean, I always talk about managers as the translation point, right? They're that translation point between the organization's goals and priorities and what individuals do every day. So we found that these 4 variables, the more likely people were to agree with them, also had a huge correlation to overall productivity. So managers having an understanding of organizational goals, managers are effective at helping individuals set goals. So they are understanding where our organization is going, and they're helping individuals set goals that are going to help them work towards that, and drawing that line of connection between what you're doing every day and organizational goals. They're effective at coaching. And again, we talked about training for that. And then providing frequent feedback to employees. So not only developmental feedback, but frequency of feedback is really important. And what we saw when we looked at high performers and low performers is, again, this big gap between how often these things were true among high performance organizations versus low performance organizations. And really, it's critical to think about how they act as that translation point. I mean, I think it's so important to help managers. Again, if managers weren't good at this, it doesn't matter where their team sits, right? They could have been remote. They could be right in front of them. These are things that you have to have in place as good managers, no matter where you are. If you're a bad manager during the pandemic, you're still a bad manager, And so how do you make sure that these are things, no matter where someone sits, no matter what their role is, having a manager there to translate those goals is really essential to high performance.
And again, just for clarity, this is people responding to a 5-point Likert scale and strongly agreeing to these different variables. But the disparity is pretty evident between high and low performing organizations. It's interesting, this whole conversation around goals, though. This is a conversation that's as old as the hills. Our organization, i4cp, we used to be called the Human Resource Institute, and we were founded decades ago by Rensis Likert, who invented the Likert scale, but also by George Ordeorn. And George was one of the fathers of management by objective and wrote several books. He was a protege of Peter Drucker, and the two of them talked about the importance of MBO, again, decades and decades ago. So this concept of goals is not new at all, but a lot of organizations feel like they've kind of gotten away from it, and managers haven't done necessarily as great a job as they can of holding people accountable to goals. and organizations haven't been cascading goals as clearly or as directly. And we're kind of moving back to that now. I think the pandemic put a little bit of a wrench into that. But one of the things that we found as part of the study was that you really should have a goal process. And that is some kind of organizational wide goal setting measurement process that you've put into place. A lot of organizations are using OKRs to do that. Many use KPIs to do that. I just mentioned MBO. There's other methods that organizations use to measure the goal process overall, but not having a process was twice as likely in a low performing organization. And it also had a negative correlation to trust and goal achievement overall. Anything else you want to add to that one, Mollie?
Just again, to echo what we were saying before, it gives us transparency between not only what the goal is, but how you're expected to achieve it. And that's really one of the ways you build trust. Again, sort of in drips and in little bits, as people are saying in the chat, you have to build it piece by piece. It can be destroyed easily, but it's really important to make sure that you have a process to not only make sure everyone's clear, but to make sure you have that transparency that, again, starts to build that trust while achieving goals at the same time.
And, certainly a lot of this comes about in the performance management process, something that we have written a lot about and have put out a number of different studies on. But as part of this study, we looked at the frequency of developmental feedback by managers. And Mollie, I'd love, again, if you could walk us through these.
Yeah, what I think is interesting here is if you look at the left two bars on the high performance organization, almost 80%, 4 out of 5 high performance organizations request that managers meet with their employees at least quarterly. So that's 4 out of 5 are suggesting that. But on the low performance organizations, over a quarter, 27% there in the purple, say they have no set expectations for when feedback should happen. So again, it's not just the frequency, but the fact that low performing organizations don't even sort of concern themselves with suggesting frequency of feedback. So again, when you think about trust, when you think about performance without that kind of feedback on a regular basis, it can be really difficult to balance not only achieving your goals, but also understanding what the person is going through. If you're only checking in with me once a year or ad hoc, how are you going to know what things are impacting my ability to achieve my goals? And so if you're trying to balance empathy and goal achievement, you really can't do it without having that kind of frequency of feedback as well.
I think a lot of managers too are going through a time period here of adjustment. We've had to work in a fully remote environment immediately following the pandemic, where sometimes it was difficult for those managers to provide this timely feedback to individuals and work more on a schedule of scheduling that feedback versus just doing it serendipitously. Today, a number of those managers have hybrid teams, right? You've got people that you're seeing on an everyday basis, and then you've got people that you're not seeing on a regular basis. And so certainly you've got to be cognizant of proximity bias, but just the ability to provide equal feedback on a frequent basis to those two types of audiences, I think is a period of adjustment for a lot of organizations and a lot of managers.
Yeah, and really putting some intentionality behind it, setting these goals of having frequent feedback is important from leaders to make sure managers understand that, and really, make it an intentional part of your day. This doesn't just happen. You don't build trust and set goals and achieve them by happenstance. It really is something that needs to be part of the everyday activity for leaders and managers.
And as we typically find, Mollie, the companies that are training managers how to do this generally are higher performing organizations and doing better at it versus just letting managers figure it out themselves. So this is a plea to our training counterparts that might be on the line today to certainly try to focus on this area for manager development.
Well, I call it the code of silence, right? You get promoted to a managerial role. You don't want to say, hey, I don't know how to do this, because you figured they promoted me. They must think I know. And senior leaders are saying things like, well, we hope they figure it out because I had to figure it out. Like there's a better way. You can actually train for this.
Yeah.
And
for sure. Well, let's go to our key finding number 3, which is something we highlighted at the beginning of this, and that was that empathy and productivity, while we've seen a pendulum swing in the best companies, they are not mutually exclusive, and that shouldn't come as a big shock. But the reason why we're making a big deal out of this is because it was a pretty precipitous drop in what organizations were telling us were priorities for leadership during the pandemic versus today. What are those priorities? And Molly, I know you were surprised to see this when we got the results back.
Well, sort of unsurprisingly dismayed, maybe might be a better way. So we kind of felt like it was bad, but boy, was it really bad. And I kind of love this slide because it shows that drop. Number one during the pandemic period was all about demonstrating empathy for individual situations, and it just dropped like a rock to the bottom. Number two and number three during the pandemic around being in tune to well-being and organizational goal achievement, those kind of stayed in the top half. But really, you talk about this whiplash. Your leaders were so focused on one type of relationship with you, and suddenly they're being taught that's gone to the bottom of the list. I think this was sort of shocking, but in some ways unsurprising to see how much it really dropped. And that remembering that your people have gone through this whiplash that you're going through as well. They've suddenly had one type of relationship with work, and now it's trying to change, and that can really destroy trust as well. But I think it was really interesting to see this precipitous drop off. Goal achievement was kind of there during the pandemic, but just the fact that of all the different focuses we asked about, it just really dropped like a rock.
Yeah, for sure. And I think certainly the return to worksite policies, I think, have had a big that was a big reason why this has happened. I think a number of individuals felt that empathy from the start, but they felt like it just went away when you're being forced to return to the office for a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
Overall.
And people are really upset about it. I mean, people feel like their trust has been broken because their employer is going back on a situation that was working for them. Now, that may or may not be true, and it may be actually that they should be back at work, but there's a lot of emotion behind it right now.
Yeah, particularly when there were big, broad statements made right after the pandemic about we don't care where you work, to today where in some cases it's been an about face. Yeah. Now, some of that has probably led to employee burnout. And Molly, I know this is a subject that you've looked at pretty extensively.
Yeah, again, that whiplash is exhausting. It's sort of exhausting to be hearing one thing from one side, one thing from the other, to have to be thinking about, gee, am I going to have to go back to work and find childcare, or readjust how my family operates because of, now I have a commute again. And so burnout is pervasive. We can see the global average. This is just a sampling of our global data, but the global average was 25% of organizations that responded indicated that the burnout is a pervasive problem for their organizations. A little bit unsurprising because we're such overachievers in the US. Sometimes we are leading the pack when it comes to burnout, but even among all the other regions that we kind of looked at, it's a significant problem for a lot of organizations. And it's one of those things that when people are exhausted and feeling burnt out, it's really hard to regain trust. It's really hard to focus on goals. So being able to kind of build those relationships back bit by bit and sort of deal with some of this burnout is also really critical to keep your troops engaged, so to speak, and wanting to help you achieve your goals.
Yeah. And obviously, we're not on this slide breaking down every region of the globe, but we just broke down regions where we had quite a bit of data and where we thought there was some interesting data to showcase. But I think a lot of this burnout, too, goes back to what we said earlier, Molly. It's, are managers focused on the employee outcomes? Are they thinking about the employee experience overall? And that certainly was something that popped up to us in the study itself.
Yeah, we saw that 63%, almost 2/3, say that organizations place a high level of importance on achievement of business outcomes when evaluating leader performance. So this is, again, people who strongly agreed with that statement. They said, about 2/3 of organizations are saying, yes, to be a good leader and when we evaluate our leaders, we want to know that they achieve business outcomes. But only 21%, 1 in 5, said the organizations place that same kind of importance on achieving those employee outcomes or those employee experience outcomes. So the majority of organizations we may be saying, hey, you've got to focus on employees and be empathetic and develop people. We're not actually evaluating leaders by that. So we're asking for one thing and evaluating them, their performance based on something else. So again, really one of those times to really consider, are we rewarding for the right things? Can you be a good leader in our organization if you're not looking at employee outcomes? Just we talk about no brilliant jerks in other roles, even managers as well. Managers who achieve great results in their team, but do it in a way that causes a lot of turnover or churn, or people aren't developing, or they're hoarding talent. Is that going to be acceptable in our organization? Are we going to not evaluate them on that and only evaluate them on overall organizational performance?
Yeah, and it might not be natural for some organizations or some leaders to really look at the employee experience as something that they're measuring against. But to try to make that easier, we've created a toolkit on how to hold leaders accountable for employee experience that I know, Molly, you and your coworkers created as part of the research offering.
Yeah, and this sort of came out of the previous study we did earlier this year on that culture fitness, looking at toxic cultures and healthy cultures. And what it is, it's a tool to help your organization build that business case for holding leaders accountable for that employee experience, and then also start to implement it within your organization. So if it's not a natural fit for you, if it's not something you're naturally already looking at, this is a way to help educate yourself and then educate your business partners as well to understand how, what is that business case for holding leaders accountable for that employee experience, and then how can you implement it within your organization.
And the stat that really jumps out is that headline here. It's 18 times more common in healthy cultures for them to do this, so hold their leaders accountable for that experience. So if you're a member on the line, you have access to this toolkit. So certainly you'll find that out on the website, or let us know if you can't find it. We'll help you get there.
I think Zeta has it as well, she can share.
Okay, great.
Chat.
Well, let's move on to the topic everybody's talking about, and that's generative AI. And that was our key finding number 4, this will certainly have a significant impact on productivity going forward.
Yeah.
Molly, you like this explanation, so I'll let you.
I do, because when I was thinking about querying the internet, people, especially in the last couple months, people were like, well, what is AI and generative AI, and how does it differ from, all these other ways we've been interacting with the internet and information? Search engines helped us find stuff. You Google something and you would find out how to do something, or where something was, or what the hours were for a particular store, or research a product. We found stuff with that. Traditional artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotic process automation, those did things for us. They might have taken a process and looked for anomalies, sped things up by automating. But generative AI makes stuff, which is a whole different way of thinking about, when you found stuff or did stuff, it was with existing sort of human generated content. It may have been generated falsely on purpose or by accident, but it was sort of a human level process that you could sort of keep up with as a human. But generative AI not only generates things, but generates them so quickly that that human check and balance that we've had for finding stuff and doing stuff, if you will, is no longer there. And so we're going to see that organizations are going to be rapidly impacted by this trend. And there's a great stat that someone put out, and we've been quoting all over the place, which is 80% of jobs in the future will have at least 10% of their work tasks impacted by generative AI. 19% of jobs will have 50% of their work tasks impacted by generative AI. So it's huge.
And from a productivity standpoint, I think that's what's going to make one of the biggest differences going forward, is how are companies leveraging AI to take away some of those mundane or rote tasks that every worker, finds themselves having to do on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, and how can we have generative AI handle those tasks for us going forward? And
it's already becoming it's already becoming a cliche that we're saying, will a robot take over your job? No, but somebody who knows how to use generative AI may take over your job.
Yep, for sure. And we have a study out in the field right now where we are looking at the impact of AI specifically on HR, and we'll be releasing that study in several weeks from now. But as we continue to look at how are organizations preparing for the impact on the workforce, you can see that there's a lot of companies that aren't discussing this at all just yet, but several more are discussing or doing it right now. When it comes to hiring for AI specific roles, particularly in HR, or communicating about this to reduce fear and uncertainty throughout the workforce, encouraging employees to identify the tasks that may be accomplished or improved by generative AI, and then developing workers from chat prompts to whatever to effectively leverage generative AI. So it's good stats, and it's clear these stats probably are changing day to day, right? So if we go ask companies, this today, we'll probably come up with different figures.
And we're even seeing things like IBM saying it's going to stop hiring on roles that might be significantly impacted by generative AI, and So it's starting to have a real consequence for organizations. It's not just, so organizations that are not discussing these things like hiring for AI specific roles in HR, other parts of the organization, start discussing, because it's coming.
Now, I should mention that the study that's out in the field is still open. So if you want to respond to it, maybe Zeta's already put it in the chat. I don't know, but I'm not looking at the chat. But certainly you have the ability to respond to that study still.
Yes, please do.
But we've seen examples across the board of where AI has had some good impact on productivity overall. 2/3 of individuals believe that AI will help increase their productivity. We've seen software engineers that can code up to twice as fast using a tool called Codex, based on the earlier version of GPT. We've seen economists that can be 10 to 20% more productive. There's been a lot of studies in the call center space, and call center workers in one study were 14% more productive when using generative AI. And the least experienced workers saw the biggest benefit, 30%. Maybe most importantly, customer satisfaction was higher when using it. And that's just a direct output of being quicker to find the right answers and making sure that you are giving the right answers overall.
Yeah, and onboarding is something that always pops to the top of the list when you talk about productivity. We did another smaller survey just in the past couple of months, and onboarding was one of the top things that organizations indicated they had done to sort of boost productivity, getting people up to speed quickly. So AI certainly has a lot of uses in that.
And we, in a couple of webinars that we've done where we've asked organizations, what are you using AI for today, specifically in HR? It's been very clear that talent acquisition has benefited the most from AI across the board. We've seen a number of organizations use it to generate job descriptions, but also just using it to help the candidate experience overall. And I know, Molly, you just did a webinar on talent acquisition technologies.
Yeah, so talent acquisition is seeing a lot of energy around use of generative AI. We had a call with over 70 of our board members. We have 6 different boards that represent different groups of HR leaders, CHROs, training and learning leaders, total rewards leaders, everything, all these different roles. And we had about 70 of them on the phone, and they were giving examples of where they're testing out generative AI. In talent acquisition, they're using it to draft job descriptions. They're using it to draft and put together interview guides for specific roles that are customized to the role and the level of the interview. We're seeing that in terms of learning and development, a lot of first drafts of curriculum are being generated with AI. Also performance reviews. A lot of senior executives talking about doing performance reviews by uploading their criteria and 360 feedback and the like. They're using it to do first drafts of performance reviews. So again, for a lot of people who, whether it's HR or in the previous slide talking about like economists, people who read and research for a living, or who write and research for a living, it's getting a lot of people from that blank page to at least some paint on the wall, if you will, to be able to generate content. And so we're seeing it throughout business, but also in HR as well. And we'll continue to watch the space because it's going to evolve quickly.
Yeah, for sure. Now, Molly, before we get into recommendations that we had in the study, maybe I'll just turn it over to Tom. I haven't been looking at the chat, Tom, but I'm just wondering if there are questions that people had that you think Molly and I should address.
Yeah, thanks for that. Molly was watching the chat and made references to some of them as we went along, and the material here, answered some of the questions as they came up. There were a couple, though, that I made note of. A couple people noted, this is maybe more of a comment, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, that going back to the issue of performance management and goal setting, the whole process there, that it's not just like frequency of feedback that matters, but also coaching managers on the quality of the feedback that's received and just how important that can be. And that can be almost as important as other factors like frequency and anything like that. Do you have any comments on that, Kevin or Molly?
No, that's absolutely right. And, I think what we find in most organizations, the ones that spend the time helping managers with the quality of that conversation, the better off that those organizations are. We've actually produced a performance management guide to help managers with some of those conversations that's really bifurcated into 2 different areas. One is just sort of a day-to-day check-in how are your employees doing, and questions that you can, ask your employees about that. The other one is more long-term and career oriented, and asking about their aspirations from a career development perspective, where they want to go long-term, and sample questions for that. I think what we found, time over time, Tom, is that managers often are pretty good once they get into those conversations. They're not perfect, but pretty good once they get into it. But sometimes starting those conversations can be awkward and can be hard. And so these question guides, I think, have helped a lot of those managers. And we've put out the same thing just for employees who want to take the initiative and have that conversation with their supervisor.
Yeah, and Kevin, that speaks exactly what Ashley just said in the chat, which is helping employees how to receive feedback. That's a skill too, how to ask for and how to receive feedback. And so that's an important part of the process as well.
Yep, for sure.
Very good. One other question that came up early on, and I think you touched, this is one of the ones where I say the material that followed somewhat touched on it. How do you measure trust? We have our trust index that we've built out of this study. But one specific question was, how do you rebuild trust once it's been broken? And the example that was given was promising employees during the pandemic that they could work from home virtually, and that would be maybe implied that it would be indefinite. And now going back on that and either forcing 3 days a week or forcing, full return to office. I think you've spoken to it to some extent by saying that, well, one key thing is to train managers for trust building culture. Also just having a more principle-based decision-making process instead of arbitrary rules. Might be too late for that in some cases, but going forward, saying that, okay, we've learned and that's what we're going to do. Anything else you would add to that, though, about how to rebuild trust once it's been broken once?
It's not easy, that's for sure. And this is a conversation I've had with several organizations. I think, and it's probably too late for this too in a lot of organizations, but when you're changing a policy like that, it's important to give lots of explanation around the reasons why. And even to admit, hey, when the pandemic hit, we weren't prepared. We did the best we could. We made some policy choices then. But for us as an organization, maybe those policies aren't adequate for the time that we're in right now. But I think and when we're putting out some material on this, I think what more and more organizations need to do is take more of a carrot approach versus a stick approach, and offer up good reasons and programs and other activities on why people should be in the office and working together. There's certainly a lot of benefits to that, and there's certainly a lot of people that want that out in the workplace. I was just talking to my daughter who's in college, and she was telling me, I don't think I'd want to work remotely. I'd want to work, with other people. And I hear that kind of comment a lot. And I think for organizations, you have to help those individuals understand the benefits of why they should be working side by side with others when you're, putting out policies like many companies have, Tom. And I'd love to hear Tom, you're an expert in this area. I'd love to hear your thoughts or Mollie's thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, Mollie,
Yeah.
further thoughts?
Well, I just think also, giving them a reason is so important. I've worked remotely and flexibly my entire career. I've either been on the road with clients, sometimes I'm in an office, sometimes I've worked from home. And I always felt like I was willing to work at any of those locations, but there had to be a reason. To fly to Cincinnati to go sit in a cubicle in a client's office and do work that I could have done at home didn't feel good. But when I had a new hire coming into the company, being in our office here in Boston every day for 3 weeks felt great because I was able to bond with them. So giving them reasons for why they should be there. And also we were talking about how do you get trust? One way is by giving it. Try an experiment, try to give someone autonomy, try and give someone a little bit of trust and hope to get it back. And you can start to build it that way too.
Yeah, that's definitely a great practice, both in work and I'd say in life more generally, in our personal lives. I know we've got the general recommendations that you're going to share with us in just a minute, but we have a few minutes left. I wanted to share just one example. A couple of slides back, you shared that 21% indicated from this study that they were, this is regarding generative AI, encouraging employees to look for ways that generative AI or automation more broadly can be used. And I just wanted to harken back to several years ago at our conference, which we have each year in Scottsdale, Arizona in March. We had Ellen Shook, the CHRO at Accenture, up on the big stage, and she shared, this was back in 2018, 2019, so certainly well before generative AI was a word that we all understood. She shared how for one part of their massive company, was about 15,000 employees. They really saw the benefits coming of automation and AI. I think it was a customer service realm. And they worked with their employees and said, if you will help us with these outside consultants figure out how to automate your jobs away, in essence, then we will backstop you with full upskilling opportunities, even college tuition, et cetera, so you can stay with the firm in a more strategic, higher end role, likely some of them getting a pay bump as a result. That was very well received. Yes, some of those thousands of employees did leave the organization during that transition, but the vast majority of them took them up on that opportunity and ended up with better paying jobs, more strategic jobs, and just happier work at Accenture, while the company had the win-win of automating away the more mundane tasks through the work with this consultant. So I just, that story from Ellen, the CHRO at Accenture, really stuck with me all those years ago. And it's a good example, even before generative AI, of this kind of next practice thinking.
Yeah, I think they've done a fantastic job. But I think they will also tell you they've got a lot of work to do. It's a long road.
Yes, no, absolutely. Just like the firms you've talked with over the years on culture, even those with strong cultures will say it's an ongoing journey, right?
Right, for sure. Well, Mollie,
right,
let's
get to the recommendations then.
Yeah, for sure. So Mollie, I'll let you walk us through. We have 4 recommendations as part of the study.
Yeah, so one is really creating that culture fitness for long-term productivity. And, Kevin, you've been talking about this for years. Your book is on this topic of how do you renovate your culture to make sure that you're supporting performance and productivity. And we actually found that organizations that have fit cultures, those that are engaging their employees and achieving wild success, are 2 times more likely to report increased employee productivity since 2020. So again, having that core of your culture being focused can really help you improve productivity. Again, focusing on goal achievement instead of where a worker sits, but don't do it at the expense of empathy. It's very easy to count and say how many people were in the office for how many days. It's not as easy to count how empathetic an exchange was between an employer and a manager. So it's important. It's not easy, but it's important to make sure that you're focusing on how people are being treated and how people are achieving their goals as opposed to where they sit. And again, with blanket statements, it can be really difficult, but some people work really well in an environment where they're surrounded by colleagues and they have that focus space. Some people work really well in other conditions. So making sure that people's workspace is appropriate to their goals can also be important. Last but not least, last 2, training managers. We've talked a lot about this, but finding ways to upskill current leaders and train future ones on those manager effectiveness traits has a big impact on trust with their teams and ultimately performance and productivity. So again, we've said this quite a bit, but making sure that you're not just throwing your managers into the role, or even if they've been there for a while, making sure that everyone's got a level set on how to improve trust and get better feedback. And then take a thoughtful and proactive approach to AI. As Tom was saying, you see it coming. What could you do to encourage workers to embrace it as appropriate, to not use it as inappropriate, and also to make sure that you're dealing with any fear and uncertainty that's being created by the dawning of this sort of interesting new concept.
Well said. Thank you, Mollie.
Thank you.
Tom, let's Mollie and I will turn it back over to you for a second because I know you've got a couple of announcements.
Yeah, so just to wrap up, first off, thank you both. This was an outstanding early look at the key findings from the productivity predicament study. So very well done. The full report's going to be coming out, I know, to members here soon, along with other assets as well. As we mentioned earlier, we've got similar meetings that we'll be holding at different times of day to accommodate all of our global counterparts. First coming up will be in the Europe, Middle East, Africa region time zone, coming up on July 19th. And then about a month later, August 16th, we'll hit the APAC, Asia Pacific region. And you can see the times there for those Eastern Standard Time, 8 a.m. in the morning, 8 p.m. at night. That's to accommodate the folks that live in those regions. And then the other announcement, this is something new for these Next Practices weekly calls, but we've gotten them approved for recertification credit hours. So anyone in the industry that has an HRCI or SHRM certification over time, you need to recertify. And there's lots of webinars and in-person conferences and other things you can do to do that. Attending these 1-hour Next Practice weekly calls now qualifies. And so if you're interested, be sure and jot down the relevant program ID for HRCI or activity ID for SHRM that you see there highlighted in yellow, and you can use these towards your recertification needs. So once again, thank you, Molly and Kevin. That was a great presentation. I want to remind folks, I alluded earlier to our Scottsdale conference that we have in Arizona each year in March. This is now open for registration for 2024. Just go to i4cp.com/conference. We don't have any of these speakers announced yet, but those that have attended past years know that we will have an outstanding lineup of thought leaders, book authors, CHROs, and even some CEOs in that lineup. So open for registration now. If you're already making your travel plans for early 2024, would love to see you there. Here are the email addresses for Kevin and Molly. If you've got any specific questions about all that they shared today, you can hit them up. Or if you've got more general questions about i4CP, feel free to contact any of the three of us.
Thank you, Tom, and a big thanks to Molly and the research team for all the work that they put in to this study on productivity. It's one that we're excited about. Hopefully we'll get a chance for our members to read the full study when it gets published in a few days.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Have a good week.